And the 10th best outfielder of the 1970s, Reggie Smith. Played most of the decade with the Red Sox and later the Dodgers. He was a 5-time All-Star, batted over 300 5 times, finished 4th in the MVP voting twice. His best 2 years were 77 and 78 with the Dodgers. Those 2 years he had a combined 61 home runs, 180 RBIs, and 186 runs scored. He scored over 100 runs twice in the 70s, had over 93 RBIs 3 times. For the decade, he had 225 home runs, 776 runs scored, and 750 RBIs. Up next at number 9, Kansas City Royals legend Amos Otis. Amos was a 5-time All-Star and twice finished in the top 5 for MVP voting. 8 times he had more than 85 runs scored for the decade, and 4 times he had more than 85 RBIs. 5 times he had more than 30 stolen bases, including 1971 when he led the league with 52. For the decade, he had 159 home runs, 753 RBIs, 861 runs scored, and 294 stolen bases. Number 8, 4-time All-Star and 2-time MVP runner-up, Greg Luzinski. Greg hit over 200 home runs for the decade, including a 4-year span from 1975 to 78 where he hit 129 homers. In 75, he led the league with 120 RBIs and had 95 RBIs or more 5 times during the decade. His decade totals include nearly 1,200 hits, 740 RBIs. He hit over 300 3 times. George Foster was a member of the Big Red Machine in Cincinnati, and despite hardly playing at all in the first half of the decade, he comes in at number 7. George Foster was the 1977 National League MVP. 1976, he was the National League MVP runner-up. 3 times in the 70s, he had over 120 RBIs, and twice he hit more than 40 home runs, including 1977 when he hit 52, becoming just the 10th Major League Baseball player to hit 50 or more home runs. He hit over 304 times, and again, this is all without playing in most of the first half of the decade. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, if you could please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And just like that, we've got 2 members of Cincinnati's Big Red Machine in the top 10. Coming in at number 6, Charlie Hustle Pete Rose. All he did was become the 1973 MVP by smacking 230 base hits. He had 115 runs scored that year and led the league with a .338 batting average. 2 other seasons during the 70s, he finished in the top 5 for MVP voting. He led the league in hits and doubles 4 times each. He hit over 300 9 times in the 1970s. He scored over 100 runs 7 times, with his lowest total being 86. He's a 2-time World Series champ, and he was the 1975 World Series MVP. And before you send me any hate mail, I know Pete Rose played a lot of third base in the 1970s, but he also played a lot of games in the outfield. He played more games in the outfield than he did at third base. Trust me, I looked it up. Number 5, Boston Red Sox Hall of Famer Jim Rice. Jim Rice was the 1975 Rookie of the Year and then the 1978 MVP. He was the American League home run champ twice, and 3 times he had 200 hits or more. During his MVP season, he led the league with 213 hits, 46 home runs, 139 RBIs. 3 times in the 70s, he finished in the top 5 in MVP voting, and for the decade, he had a batting average of .310. The 4th best outfielder of the 1970s, Dave Parker. Dave Parker finished 3rd in National League MVP voting in both 1975 and 1977. And then in 1978, he won it all. He was the National League MVP in the year that he hit 30 home runs, had over 100 runs scored, had 117 RBIs, and led the league in batting average that season at 334. He was a two-time batting champ. He hit over 308 or better each of the 5 seasons that he played in the 1970s. He's a 3-time Gold Glove winner, and 72 times in the 1970s he threw out a base runner from the outfield. Now, Dave Parker, interesting little story here. In 1979, he signed a five-year, $5 million contract, making him just the second Major League Baseball player to earn an average of $1 million per year. And off the top of my head, help me out here, I think the first player was Nolan Ryan. Number 3, known for his combination of power hitting and speed, Bobby Bonds, very quietly I think, had one of the most productive decades in the 1970s. He's the first player to hit 30 home runs and have 30 stolen bases in a season more than once. And he did it 4 times in the 1970s. 9 times during the decade, he scored 93 runs or more, including 5 seasons where he had over 100 runs scored. 4 times he knocked in over 100 RBIs. He had 30 home runs or more 4 times, including 39 in 1973, where he famously was just 1 home run short of being the first person to have 40 home runs and 40 stolen bases in the same season. And speaking of stolen bases, Bobby Bonds had 40 or more stolen bases 6 times during the decade. He had 380 stolen bases for the decade. He had 280 home runs, again, for the decade. Over 1,000 runs scored, 856 RBIs, and over 1,500 hits. Now, Bobby Bonds is not in the Hall of Fame, but I kind of feel like he should be. Let me know if you disagree. Number 2, Willie Stargell. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail again for this. Willie Stargell played a lot of first base in the 1970s, but just like Pete Rose, he also played a lot. He spent a lot of time in the outfield. Trust me. My favorite Willie Stargell story that I came along while I was researching this is that he would often warm up in the on-deck circle with a sledgehammer, which is crazy, but I'm not making that up. So Willie Stargell was a 1979 MVP. He hit 32 home runs that year. 3 other seasons during the decade, he finished in the top 3 for MVP voting. 5 times he hit 30 or more home runs, including twice where he hit more than 40. 6 times he had more than 90 RBIs, and 3 of those years he had more than 110 RBIs. He hit over 290 6 times. He's a 2-time world champion, including 1979 when he was the World Series MVP. He has more home runs in the 1970s than any other player with 296, and he is the only National League player ever to win the National League MVP, the National League Championship Series MVP, and the World Series MVP, all in the same season. Here we go, the number 1 greatest outfielder of the 1970s, Mr. October, Reggie Jackson. Maybe the most colorful, most opinionated, most controversial player of his era. He was an 8-time All-Star, and in 1973 he won the American League MVP. He won the World Series 5 times in the 1970s, 3 times with the Oakland A's and twice with the hated New York Yankees. During 2 of those World Series, he was the World Series MVP. For the decade, he hit 292 home runs, plus 14 more in the playoffs. He scored 800 runs, hit more than 900 RBIs, had over 1,400 hits, and although not known for his speed, right, he had 183 stolen bases during the decade. Despite all that power, he hit 286 or better 4 times. He had 89 or more RBIs 7 times in a row. So I got to make some apologies to some of these players. Number 1, Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron had some great seasons in the early 1970s, and I almost put him on this list, but he didn't really play a whole lot in the 70s, and a lot of the times that he did play, he was a first baseman, so I was like, you know what, I'm going to leave him off the list and let some of these other guys shine. There's so many great players in the 70s that I had to leave off. Fred Lynn, Al Oliver, Ken Singleton, Rick Monday, Bobby Mercer. I didn't know what to do with them all. There's so many great guys. maybe I should make a part two or something. I don't know, but this was a really hard list to put together. Thanks for watching, everybody.